I'm Elizabeth Ford. My pronouns are she, her. I am from Ellsworth. Yeah, and I came to this event because I organized it. So you can also add that in there if you'd like. If anybody else would like to go, that's totally fine.
I'm Amanda Wayne. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from South Portland and I'm here because I'm an intern and I helped promote this event. I didn't really help plan it, but that's basically just why I'm here.
Yes, you did. You did a lot. Also, I guess I'll go next. My name is Michaela or Mitch. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a senior at Casco, and I'm an intern at the League of Women Voters. And I'll pass it to Theo.
Hello, everyone. My name is Theo Green. I live in Portland, but I am a professor of sociology at Bowdoin College, specializing in LGBT studies and queer placemaking in cities. And I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and Alex, if you'd like to go next, I think it'd probably be the most productive.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm Alex Petrovnia. My pronouns are he, him. I am actually not from Maine. I am calling in from central Pennsylvania, which is where I live currently. I am the president and founder of the Transformations Project, which is a small nonprofit dedicated to tracking and informing about the anti-trans legislative crisis, which is why I've been invited to be one of your panelists today. So I'm super excited to be here, and I really look forward to what we're going to talk about.
All right, does anybody else want to introduce themselves or just kind of want to sit back and watch? I saw some people were just kind of uncomfortable with that kind of stuff.
I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Susanna and pronouns she, her. And I live in Freeport. I'm not there at the moment. I'm at a friend's house out of town for some work, and I am here because several reasons. One is I'm on the state board and executive committee for the League of Women Voters, Democracy Maine, but that's more just official. This is an issue that is very meaningful for me, and I've written a little bit about on legislation and have testified a few times, and so it's something that I'm quite passionate about. So I'm really keen to hear. I've been involved in the youth council, so I want to support that as well. Thank you. And I may have my video off just because I have a handful of things going on in the background of people doing some work.
Oh, that's no problem. All right. Does anybody else want to introduce themselves, or are you guys all set? Okay. So a little bit past 6 o'clock, so I'm having, Liana. Liana, she's from Central Maine originally and is an SMCC student. Her pronouns are she and her, and she's here because doesn't say. But very excited to have you. Yeah, and I think we'll probably get started since it's kind of quite a bit past 6, so we're going to start about that. And Evan's going to screen share for us. Perfect.
Yeah, so before we start discussing and asking questions to our panelists, we just wanted to give a quick overview of both the space that we'll be creating here and some of the things we'll be talking about. So these are some community rules and guidelines that we came up with. Obviously, I'm sure most of you or all of you can read, but I'll also read them out loud. So enter this space with respect and kindness for everyone's identity. Step up, step down, which means please share your opinion, but also leave space for other people to share their experiences and speak up as well. And come ready to learn and be challenged. Come with the best intentions possible for the space and community, which we're trying to build. Mind everyone's safety and well-being. Center marginalized voices. Support each other. Be accountable and hold each other accountable. And remember, this is an imperfect space. Thank you. All right, and I'll be launching into giving you a little bit of background on this topic. So 240. 240 is the number of anti-LGBTQ plus bills which have been filed in the US as of March 2022. These bills range from healthcare denial to bathroom and education restrictions, and this number has skyrocketed from 41 in 2018. Next slide. Can we move on to the next? Yeah. Thank you. And here is a timeline. So I started the timeline in the 17th and 18th century because this is an issue that is most kind of originates in colonialism and anti-Indigenousness. But I'll start at 1848, which is in Columbus, Ohio. They introduced the earliest US laws prohibiting being in public in dress, quote unquote, not belonging to his or her sex. And many others continued to introduce such laws. In fact, one of these prohibited, quote unquote, impersonating a female was still active in New York as of 2011. And this is one of the earliest measures criminalizing being queer and trans in the US. So yeah. And then we move on to a 1910, which is the year that the Federal Mann Act of 1910 passes, prohibiting the transportation of women across state lines for quote unquote immoral reason. The first of many laws criminalizing sex work, which is one of the only ways in which trans people could make money throughout history, because they would be ostracized by their families and kicked out of their homes, so they would be homeless and they would not be able to have jobs because their communities would kind of just ostracize them. And then in 1918, Magnus Hirschfeld at the Institution of Sexual Science in Berlin coined the term transvestite, making one of the first time in modern history that trans and gender and non-conforming people are included in medicine. And they researched sex changes, gender affirming healthcare. But unfortunately, a lot of the research was burned down in 1933 by Nazi book burners, and that continued a lot throughout World War II. And in the 40s and the 50s, kind of see this, the visibility of trans people begin to rise with Christine Jorgensen, who became widely known as the first trans woman to undergo sex reassignment, and Charlotte McLeod, who was the first transsexual person to challenge their state in trying to force them to define their gender and threatening her citizenship as well. In the 60s, the 60s and the 70s were decades plagued by violence and poverty for trans people. As more came out, unfortunately, their families continued to kick them out, and homelessness statistics began to rise. And but however, trans and queer people continued to organize. They were often the leaders and workers of many movements today, including the gay liberation movement. That's fun. The gay liberation movement, in which was kicked off on June 28th, which of 1969, which was the Stonewall riot, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And then in 1970, James Clay Jr. was murdered by two Chicago police officers. This kind of marks the first of many, well, not the first, but the first documented of many murders of trans Black people in the US. Brutal murders, not only just by the police, but also community members. And in the 80s and 90s, we continued to see a rise in violence with the AIDS epidemic, but also we continued to see trans and queer organizing with the ACT UP movement. But the string of criminalizing continues with the 1988, the Reagan administration began to introduce laws penalizing the spread of HIV, which basically means that people could be arrested for giving somebody else HIV. And now we are seeing a rise again in anti-trans legislation around the country. Can we go to the next slide? So yeah, So what are no promo homo laws? And this is written by my amazing friend Maisie. Anyway, she says some of the earlier legislation that set in stone this ideology was the phrase no promo homo, originally coined by Non Hunter to describe the Briggs Initiative, a 1978 California ballot proposal allowing the termination of any public school teacher who engaged in the advocating, soliciting, imposing, encouraging, or promoting of private or public homosexual activity. Many of these laws were introduced in the 60s and skyrocketed in the 80s and 90s at the height of the AIDS epidemic. There are only 5 states which have maintained their decades-old no promo homo laws, as most were struck down following the Supreme Court ruling in Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, which found the criminalizing of homosexual behavior unconstitutional. Can we have the next slide? And the most famous instance of these bills is currently the Florida House Bill 1557, also known as the Don't Say Gay Bill, which recently passed in the Florida State Senate on March 8th, 2022. So, and this is a quote from the Don't Say Gay Bill itself. Classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3 or in the manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards, end quote. So this bill prohibits instruction and discussion on gender identity and sexual orientation in Florida schools. This will put restrictions on books, sex education, mental health, school professionals, and etc. Many scholars and journalists, including New York Times journalist Amelia Nierenberg, have emphasized the vague language of these pieces of legislation as one of the most dangerous aspects of this situation, because it leaves a lot of it up for interpretation. And I'm going to pass it on to Elizabeth.
So I'm going to cover some legislation targeting trans people, kind of to give you a background on why we're having this discussion. So transgender students have been banned from participating in K-12 sports for discriminatory reasoning, claiming that it will be unfair due to their hormones or belief that transgender women pose a threat to women's sports. The map kind of shows the extent of that legislation in the United States. In 2021, 37 states introduced bills to limit or prevent participation in high school or college athletic teams based on biological sex. However, only 6 have successfully passed versions of these bills into law, including Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Idaho had previously passed a similar law in 2020. These laws are not actively preventing the participation. Many of them have policies that instead discriminate against them by requiring certain levels of hormones or certain surgeries to have been done. Even the Maine Principals Association only allows participation consistent with their gender identity when it would not, quote, result in the unfair athletic advantage or present an unacceptable risk of injury to other student athletes, meaning that transgender athletes can participation in the Maine high school sports is up to the subjective opinion of the MPA. Next slide. And we have to remember that Maine isn't exempt from these. That's really important because there's been 3 anti-trans bills, all of which failed, but were still introduced to the Maine legislature. The Maine LD 96 would have prohibited any student from joining or participating in an interscholastic or intramural athletic team that is designated for females, women, or girls if they did not pass a series of tests. They would need to have a signed statement from a doctor that the student's internal and external reproductive anatomy was of the female sex. They had naturally occurring levels of testosterone, and that an analysis of students' chromosomes showed that there was 2 X chromosomes. And then there was LD 1238, which would have changed the definition of public accommodation to stop including privately owned shelters for women or temporary housing for women who are in reasonable fear of their safety. This is in response to a statute added in 2021, which guarantees that there would be equal access to public accommodations without any discrimination, which included these public shelters. In other words, they wanted to make it so transgender women could be removed from women's shelters, since it would be legal to discriminate against them in that situation. And then the LD 1401 is very similar to the first one. It basically, any level of schooling in the state that received federal funding would prohibit a person whose biological sex assigned at birth was male from participating in an athletic program that was designated for women or girls. This is another bill basically attempting to do the same thing as the first one, restricting transgender women's rights to participate in sports. However, this one did not specify how the sex would be confirmed or what tests would be done to participate. Next slide. And then there's several recent bills passed restricting gender-affirming healthcare, which directly harms the safety and well-being of many trans youth. The Alabama SB 184 restricted all gender-affirming healthcare for minors, including puberty blockers, surgeries, and hormone replacement therapy for any transition-related care. However, it specifically allowed corrective surgeries for intersex traits. Any violation of this bill is considered a Class C felony, which could result into a sentence of up to 10 years. It also requires any school employee to inform the legal guardians of a minor if their gender identity does not match that of the sex they were assigned at birth, and prohibits them from keeping their gender identity private, teachers encouraging that. There's also part of the bill that ensures that the rest of the bill will remain in effect if one section is found to be illegal. Arizona is very similar with their SB 1138, which was also passed in Arizona. It bans surgeries done for transition purposes on minors, but allows the so-called corrective procedures for intersex traits. But this bill, unlike in Alabama, allows exceptions for injuries, illness, or imminent danger of death. Violations are only considered to be unprofessional conduct by a medical professional, which makes them subject to disciplinary action rather than jail time. And then Texas has their governor's order, which isn't legal at all, really. But both of these bills were in part inspired by it. It was a letter that the Texas governor sent out to the Department of Family and Protective Services. It directed the agency to classify medical treatments for transgender youth as child abuse under existing state law. He wanted DFPS to investigate parents who help their children get access to these treatments, and hoped to impose penalties on any mandatory reporters who did not report instances of treatment to DFPS. However, it did not appear to be legal. It is not legal. Seeing as the governor cannot define what child abuse is in Texas, he has to go through the state legislator, who then can delegate people to write regulations. Therefore, since it did not go through the proper lawmaking channels, it is going to be quite easily taken down once the lawyers kind of get into that. And next slide, I think. So now that we have some background, we're just going to talk about what we can do as a community in Maine, and talk to our panelists. But first, we're going to allow any questions you might have, and kind of, as Evan is kind of stopping the screen share. So if anyone has any questions, they are welcome to either do it out loud or on the chat.
Yeah, just questions, or if you need clarification on anything. We know we just threw a lot of information at you in just about 20 minutes, so yeah.
I don't have a question per se, but I'm just really grateful that you dug through as much history as you did. And I was listening, I mean, some of the recent bills, there was some testimony that I was listening to yesterday, I believe, talking about, I was in conjunction with one of the bills I think it was in Florida, with the idea that, even talking about transgender, they were talking about, having a trans flag, having rainbow flag, whatever, was bringing in the idea that it was telling kids that being trans is a possibility, and telling kids that, if they see these, they will be gay type thing. It's like, it's off, and going on about how, we're offering these opportunities for people to make these decisions for themselves. And, for me, just listening to so much of this, and, over the past, especially with the spate of bills that have come out, as you mentioned, in the past couple of years, we're just neglecting the past couple hundred years of so much history. And so many of these bills seem to be the idea of, okay, here's some new phenomenon that people are getting onto now because it's seeming cool, and we're trying to prevent that, with no discussion. I mean, the whole, no discussion about the fact that, people are who they are, and that's fabulous, and they're going to be who they are whether we talk about different identities or not. And so that's just so much missing for me from so many of the conversations that people are having at the sort of national and state levels. So I'm just really grateful that you're being very comprehensive and really, really coming at it from a much more historical perspective as well, to show that this is, this isn't a new topic. So I'm just really grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So I think we're going to move into some panelist questions. And Alex or Theo, whichever one of you feels ready to answer first, but I will be asking the first question, which is how, in your opinion, as a person who does what you do for a job, how do you think these impact trans and queer people nationwide?
Sure, I'll go first. Thank you. I think, just piggybacking off what Susanna was just saying, I as I was watching your presentation, I also couldn't help but think about the kind of interconnectedness of so many of these laws that are coming into place that are impacting the queer and trans communities, particularly as we think about how a lot of those initiatives and things that are even, as we think about like equality. So I'm thinking about like the Employment Non-Discrimination Act that continues to sort of come up every once in a while in the federal government. That isn't always trans inclusive, and it's often advanced by members of our own LGBT community. And so I think, one of the things I kind of wanted to piggyback about, this conversation is also the importance of thinking about how interconnected this is. And sometimes even within the LGBT community, we have a tendency to marginalize, members of our community that really need our support to build the kinds of coalitions that we need to bring. And I think building on that, I think it's also all these laws, I think, really do impact us here in Maine, even though they may not be coming. It just takes, one governor or one election, right, for people to push these ideas. And I think the problem, particularly with the Florida bill, is the fact that now you're beginning to see other legislatures across the country now trying to advance certain kinds of bills of their own. So I think it's really important to consider how, not only in terms of the coalitional politics within LGBT rights, but then also as we think about how, it seems like a domino effect sometimes where one state may pass something and everyone else sees the possibility of pushing these anti-trans bills, whether it is in terms of, athletics now, whether it's in terms of talking about it in schools and thinking about gender in a much more expansive way. They're all connected and they are our problems.
So I think you want to add to that, Alex, or we can always move on to the next one if you're ready.
Yeah, I absolutely want to add to that. I think Theo is completely right in that a lot of the time, the LGBT community at large allows the trans community to be sort of on its own. And I think that is a fundamental failure, as Theo was talking about, of recognizing that interconnectedness of our communities. And you can see that even in how these bills are progressing. 200 of those 240 anti-LGBT bills are anti-trans bills. And I think it's very important to point that out, that trans people are the #1 target here. And the broader LGBT bills that are coming out are happening because they've gained ground. Trans people were the canary in the coal mine, as it were. And they, the forces, the conservative forces that are pushing these bills are basically seeing how far they can go before they get pushed back. And when people treat the trans community as being, an acceptable loss, or as not the line in the sands that you need to stop these issues at, then they're just going to try to take more and more. And I completely agree with what Theo was saying there, just to do that. Another thing that I do want to bring up is that I think it's really important to recognize that the impacts of these bills go far beyond just legislation. These bills have massive cultural impact and they have massive mental health impact. We have the data that shows that every time one of these bills is proposed, the rates of calls to like the Trevor Project and other suicide helplines for LGBT groups increase in direct proportion. So we know, regardless, we have the data to show that this is having a massive impact on the mental health of our community, particularly of the youth of our community. And it absolutely makes sense that that is the case. But these bills even being introduced is dangerous. And I think that that speaks to you guys being in a state like Maine, which is typically considered to be, safe. I think it's very important to notice that those bills did get introduced and that those definitely will have an impact even in Maine. And that there's nowhere that it's acceptable to really let your guard down at this point.
Yeah, I think this is where we open the rest of the group to kind of answer this question. And in response to what both Theo and Alex were saying, as a person who was doing the research on this trans history, I think it's really interesting that these bills are being introduced a lot in schools and school sports. Because like the history was really, really hard to find. And I think, in my personal opinion, I haven't really, I don't have a degree in this, but I think my theory, like, this works because people don't talk about it. It's largely based in erasure. You don't have the information that is available to you, not only scientifically to understand gender and sex in schools as children, but also it's such a taboo. People never talk about it. And like in my experience, the only adults I've ever really talked to about it are, yes, my family, because they're really open, but also my teachers. So I think when you remove that resource from queer and trans and other LGBTQ children, there's such a massive resource for them. And that's not, I don't know if this is like hyperbole, but it feels like educational genocide. You know what I mean? It's being erased from the books. It's making trans children think that they don't exist in history. But yeah,
I'm
someone
sorry.
else.
Can I
No,
add
go ahead.
something really quickly to that? Because I think that's a really important point as well, right? You think about how long it has taken for us to reclaim, right, trans people of color as some of the vanguards of the Stonewall riots. I think that erasure is intentional. And once again, going back to the point I made earlier, it's often perpetrated even by members within our own sort of family umbrella. And so I think that's really important for us to think about, this idea of erasure that comes about. And I think it does have, as Alex sort of has mentioned, right, these huge effects in terms of mental health, which we also don't talk about. We're also not capable of really thinking about mental health. I mean, we barely think about it in general, throughout our society, but then also to think about it in terms of queer and trans youth, and queer and trans youth of color, in particular. I think, again, we see multiple ways in which this erasure continues to happen. And I think, one of the ways in which we can sort of help challenge that is to start thinking about, like, where are we missing in these histories, and beginning to rewrite ourselves back into these histories. I often joke about that before Marsha P. Johnson, right? There was William Dorsey Swann in the 19th century, who also would have been a trans woman, who actually also fought the police in a time when you can't imagine Washington, D.C., in the South, no less, right? These particular practices were taboo. People don't know who William Dorsey Swann is, but the more we can raise the names of these people who have been so important and vital to pushing and advancing broader LGBT rights forward, right? Because these are the people that were at the front lines because of the laws, right, that made them easy targets for raids and bars and other kinds of places, right? People went to the Stonewall. Cis men were often able to go. Cis white men were often able to go. It was the trans women, right, that often encountered the police harassment and the arrest, which is also why they're on the front lines. So I think fighting erasure, I think, is critically important. I'm sorry I spoke too much, but I just wanted to amplify that.
Did not speak too much at all. That was great. Anyone else want to say anything on this?
All right, then we can totally move on to our kind of next broad discussion question. So what have you found is an effective way to improve the situation or support people who are targeted by these bills? It's kind of a really open question, I understand. So.
Yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Michaela.
No, I was gonna say let's open it up to our speakers and then the group again.
Oh, okay, great. I just want to say, so for my part, from the legislative perspective, I would say contacting your representatives and actually, making your opinion known there is a lot more effective than people think it is, particularly because all of these bills are at the state levels. And what happens at the state level is that lots of bills go unnoticed, and a lot of people aren't very involved in their state level politics. And so for a bunch of people, even 5 or 10 people, to take notice of a bill happening at the state level is a huge deal and will definitely draw their attention. From a broader perspective than that, just what you can do, I would absolutely recommend getting in touch with local orgs and trying to build that community support. That community support on the ground level is so essential. And I can speak to, as somebody, so I founded an org, mine is a national org, but it welcomes anybody, any volunteers are welcome with my org. Giving people something constructive that they can do to fight back against this has been so transformative for so many people. I've had so many people in my org and attached to my org in some way tell me that they're like, thank you for building something that I can do something rather than just watching it happen. And I really want to emphasize that overall, that whether it be hosting something like this or whether it be organizing with your local groups or whether it be, making sure your homeless shelter in your area is accepting of trans people, every bit that you can do matters, and there is absolutely something you can do, especially in the digital internet age. There is so much that can be done, seriously. So thank you for hosting this, Elizabeth and Michaela.
I agree with that 100%. And I also think too, right, that there's a number of other things that we're not talking about here. For example, the epidemic of trans women of color being murdered, right, at disproportionate rates. And the question, I think, we have to ask ourselves, where are our LGBT organizations coming to the forefront, right? Fighting the way that they did for marriage equality. So I think part of that, to amplify again what was just said, has to also do, putting pressure on our LGBT organizations, right? Our HRCs, our Equality Maines, these mainstream organizations that continue to fundraise in order to ensure, right, equality for all. And I think, the notion of making these issues a priority, and putting in the same kind of fervor is going to require people to actually be vocal and speak up, and as well as volunteer, as well as participate, and educate people on these issues and be on the ground. But I think it's also important to sort of apply that pressure, because again, certain kinds of laws can easily sort of, unfortunately, the reality is, right, certain marginalized groups become exchanged for the sake of the majority, and that's something that has to stop.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I also, I just do want to emphasize that I think that a lot of pressure, particularly from younger people, and particularly as we move forward, is going to be necessary to shift these orgs. Because right now I work, with these orgs. I, am in several of their meetings on policy. Far too often, trans people are an ideological issue to them rather than a tangible one. And far too often, trans people are a sacrifice they are willing to make, whether they will admit it or not. And that goes doubly, as Theo said, for trans people of color, particularly. And that has to change, or we're not going to win this. And as I said before, it is really death by degrees. And if they can take out the most vulnerable among us, the most marginalized among us, they're just going to come for the next and the next and the next and the next. And it's not going to stop. There's not going to be a point where they're satisfied or there's enough. We have to protect all of our people. We have to really, this is the time that we really need to have coalition, particularly around trans issues. And you see this historically as well. I'm really glad you brought up the historical issues as well. The queer community at large owes so much to trans people, particularly trans people of color, in terms of liberation and in terms of advancing our rights. And yet that's truly unrecognized and unadmitted, because there are many, many people that I think are uncomfortable with being in coalition and in solidarity with those people. And that is just going to be a disaster going forward until we change that.
So is there anything anybody would like to add? We can kind of open this up to the group if somebody wants to talk about this or kind of share their comments or questions. But I, for one, have seen how important it is to have youth on the ground working. I, for the past 2 years, have been working with my city to try to get a rainbow crosswalk, which is it's paint. Like, it shouldn't be that hard, but it took us 2 years. We finally got it this year, but the amount of hate that we had to go through just to get it through was really terrible. I got called a murderer, a sinner, and an enemy of the state all in one meeting, just for trying to advocate for not only the youth, but the older people who weren't able to express their identity and show that we have a welcoming community. And that advocacy on the ground is it got my conservative small town in down East Maine to kind of make those changes, despite not everyone being accepting, and trying to kind of, the groundwork, those young people who are, if the young people are more liberal, eventually we're going to be able to vote. We're going to be able to change these things. And it's really important to get involved early so you can kind of like start making changes early, start making them now. That way, when you're of voting age, you already know what you need to do. You already know what you're doing. Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I think those are all great ways to contribute to the community and to support people. But I want to add 2 things. I think the reliance on community is severely understated when it comes to these issues. Like community organizing, like just having a neighbor that will be there, that will be there, like getting to know your community, getting to know who has what skills and building off of each other, because yes, government is important and legislation is important, but as we're seeing through these bills, they're not always on our side. They're not, most of the time they're not going to help us, especially if you are an already marginalized person. So yeah, I think the community aspect of like community aid and community building is understated, and also money. I wish it didn't have to bring it into this, but like it's so important to not only queer and like individual queer and trans people, but also the organizations and the local businesses. Like if you have the money, give it to them, support your homeless shelter, support like all the people that are doing the hard work, because money is not coming in. But yeah, sorry if I took up too much time, but that's all I wanted to share.
I actually had one thing, just because we were talking about ways of supporting folks that are impacted. And I realized, so I mentor some younger trans folks, and one of them is in Alabama. And he's been struggling because the evidence that his state hates him is rough. But also he's been struggling. He's on his way out. He's got a plan. He's going to be okay. He knows where he's going next. And, he's about to graduate from high school. But he, because of the way the queer community works, is now basically the mentor and support for some 15-year-old trans kids. And he's trying to figure out from his ripe old age of 17, how to support these 15-year-olds who still have to stick it out in a place where if they come out at school, their teachers are going to be required by law to tell their parents. And they're going to get thrown out of their houses. So basically, I've been spending time trying to offer emotional support to this young man, but also mostly safety planning. And literally making plans and helping him learn how to help other people make plans, make contingency plans, find contacts, build networks. And I realized it's not just check in and make sure people are okay. We are literally doing safety planning and kind of trying to build ways of surviving for folks, especially young folks, especially people of color who are most targeted, right? And I think that labor is genuinely quite invisible, partly because it's not usually being done in a big organized way. It's usually being done by individuals, but also because we're doing it quietly on purpose. These are people who have to stay closeted. So we can't exactly help them very loudly, right? So I feel like that's a corner of the work that might get overlooked fairly often.
Alex, you go ahead. I can see that you are bursting with things to say.
Yeah, just in jumping off of Evan's point, I want to plug one org that my org works pretty closely with. That is a new up and coming org. It's called the Trans Family Network, and its entire purpose is to connect people with those resources to help them, if they need to, escape from these legislative situations, but to provide support in general with these legislative situations. So if anybody is interested in checking them out, or if anybody is able to donate to them, I would highly recommend the Trans Family Network. They can be found at transfam.net.
I just have something. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. You're good.
I was going to say something else. You guys have all brought in very good points. So sorry, mine's kind of lacking, but also just holding people accountable, especially in schools, and the teachers need to have a role in correcting the behavior, especially with the Don't Say Gay bill, when teachers have to enforce expose one's identity. Especially, I go to a religious school, a little private school in Maine, and with this, people try to justify their hatred by religion. Yet once we have theology teachers going, there's no way this religion justifies this behavior, that stuff. It really impacts on changing the behavior and mindset, and shows that without this toleration, people don't want to expose it in public, and it'll transfer onto home. Sorry, that was a bad explanation, but
does anybody have anything else to add, or should we move on? This is my sister in the background. She decided to make an appearance. And so the next question, if no one has anything to add, is what are some resources that you would like to share or amplify for trans and genderqueer youth in Maine? And that's kind of something that we've already gotten started on with the links in the chat. And yeah, I'll pass it to our panelists first.
Yes. I have been really impressed with a lot of the work that Maine Transnet has done in terms of not only generating and building community for queer and trans people across across the state, but also I think in terms of the work that they're doing to challenge and fight legislation. Seems like a weird echo. I hope that's not me. And so I think, it's definitely one of those things to explore. And there is enormous emphasis on programming opportunities for youth as well. And so I think that's definitely one worth checking out. I also do think that Equality Maine has also done some tremendous work as well in terms of providing sort of resources and access to build community, to educate our queer and trans youth as well. They have a wonderful summer program, a summer camp that I sometimes come in and do a little history lesson for them. So a little plug, but the goal is to build that program is designed to build young leaders to help provide support to go back to their schools and their hometowns, to be able to provide support in the absence of authority figures and leaders that may have that may lack that education. I think it really is important to underscore that our movement has been grassroots for a long time for a reason, and sometimes the best people that can support us are each other. So those are two that I can throw out there now.
Yeah, I already feel like I plugged my org and I've plugged the Trans Family Note. I guess the last one I want to plug, if anyone is interested, there is a new org starting up that is kind of trying to take after ACT UP during the AIDS crisis, and is recognizing really the truly deathly consequences of these legislation and this culture war. And they are called Tear It Up. If anybody is interested in them, they are really focused more on loud, extravagant protest and disruption at all costs, which I think is definitely something that needs to be done at this point.
Hey, and really quick, we got a comment from Liliana that does ask a question. So I'm going to do that really quick. Thank you for sharing all of those. Those are like super cool ones. Okay, so she says, I'm really interested in the discussion of the community. I haven't really felt that internet communities are sufficient for trans people, both because of the anonymity and distance, and because of the immense amount of vitriol on the internet. I also understand a lot of brick and mortar queer spaces are becoming harder to find these days. What can we do to make more queer spaces, especially in more hostile areas?
A very big question, but a very important one. A lot of my work often focuses on, as we think about, a lot of the LGBT spaces, which unfortunately are designed for, for adults. There's very few spaces that are out there for our youth to be able to find and congregate and to see community and all that good stuff. But one of the things I think is really important is the reminder that we're all in some way placemakers, that we all have the ability to come together and create certain kinds of safe spaces, to have conversations, to sort of find the kind of community that we're lacking, even if it might be in a cafe, or it might be in a park, or it might be in a private space. I think sometimes building those connections in a very small way can be very, very important. Whether it's thinking about a book club, or thinking about talking about current events, or talking about something that you share in common. All of those things are really important strategies for, I think, creating spaces. One of my favorite studies explores how queer and trans youth in Midwestern rural towns actually take over their Walmart and turn it into a makeshift ball. They just use the aisles and they do death drops and they play with the toys and do all sorts of crazy things, fun things. But even though like it could be an annoyance to the people in the store shopping, it is a way for young people to find to create spaces that allow them to express themselves in their own terms. And I think that's something else I would also emphasize. You know, it is important for you to find spaces where you feel not only comfortable and that's affirming with things that you also find very interesting as well. So yeah.
Can I answer this question? Because really quickly, Portland Public Library has this month where they do a queer book club, and it's so much fun. You should all show up. It's super cute, and it's a great way to build community and also just have some like joy, because sometimes we talk a lot about like dark things when we're doing organizing like this, but also there's some really fun things that are part of building queer and trans community. And also, yeah, in my experience in building community, I really just find like one queer friend and stick to them, and then the group just kind of starts growing. They can't stop you. You're just gonna keep growing. There's nothing they can do. And yeah, and it really happens, I think, in those small individual ways where you find one friend and then you support each other, and then you find another friend and you support each other, and next thing you know, you have a network. But yeah, we also have a document of resources that we thought were good to share that we'll be sending out after the meeting in case people are interested, with links and all that to sign up.
I want to give a little shout to an old org that's still around, which is PFLAG. I used to run a PFLAG chapter, help run a PFLAG chapter out west. There's a chapter in Portland, there's one in Waterville. I have no idea what the main chapters are doing, but overall, the organization exists to try to create those spaces and network queer people and their families. It started out as an organization specifically for families and allies, but it isn't anymore. They actually changed the name. It's just PFLAG now. It doesn't stand for anything. They said it's not an acronym anymore. But that kind of organization can also be really helpful. It really depends on what folks are doing in your area, but it's always sort of worth checking because they will have already started a network and they might have people you can hook in with that way.
I can also kind of speak to this if, oh, sorry, Alex, did you want to say something? I could wait. No, okay. At least for me, my GSDA at the high school, or a lot of other people know them as GSAs. Ours had a name change a little while ago. But yeah, I use that as my kind of space, if that makes sense. Using I know not every high school has one, but I found mine really helpful. Even if we're just, while lately it's been a little bit more policy work, usually it's just a fun place to hang out and eat snacks. We have a Unitarian church that makes us snacks and brings them up to the high school. It's pretty awesome. But yeah, just kind of finding those spaces even in your own school, because I know a lot of people don't feel comfortable going to GSAs because, oh, it's just a couple people and it's not going to be fun, but it's seriously so much fun, even if it's the weird ones. It's so much fun to hang out with even then. Seriously, find those spaces. And at least Michaela says, like, find one queer friend and stick with them. In my experience, you've already found them. They're just going to come out a little bit later. Like, we had this whole friend group. One came out, and then the next year, like, another couple came out, and it usually happens that way in my experience, but you know. But yeah, finding those people around you is really important. Yeah.
There was a second part to that question, which is how do we as youth improve and amplify these resources and further advance them? Please feel free to answer either part of the question. And yeah. And also just quick adding to the last thing I said. Unfortunately, because of some of the things that we talked about on the timeline, we don't have a lot of queer and trans elders. So you might have to create these resources for these communities. Like, you will have to start them, unfortunately. But in my personal experience, when you do find them or when you do start building them, they will be beautiful, and it will be such a bigger world in your mind. And it makes such a big difference in not feeling alone and having support, and also like political organizing. But yeah, because we don't have queer and trans elders, we might have to be the ones to start these. But also there are a lot to amplify and improve. And I'll pass it to the rest of the group.
I completely agree with that. And I agree with that for one important reason. As a college professor, I see that, young people are developing new language and have new needs that change before we even have words for them, before we have language for it. So I think it is important for, I think it's important for two things. First of all, I think it is good to educate your elders. I guess that's me. I learn as much from my students as I teach them about the issues and the issues that impact your everyday lived experience. I sometimes find myself absolutely amazed at learning, at the kinds of challenges, the kinds of opportunities, the moments where, people are finding joy through various kinds of activities that I hear, know nothing about, all sorts of games, things like that. So I think educating your elders is really important about the things you need. Like, what do you need? But that said, also, I think it is about taking that initiative as well, right? Sometimes, it is taking that first step that I think is also very, very important. So I completely agree with Michaela and what was just said.
I guess I just want to add briefly that I agree with all of what everyone else has said, and those spaces are so, so important. But I do want to emphasize, don't discount online community. In many places, that's the only community that people have access to, whether it be through circumstance or through location. And online community can be life-saving, and it can absolutely be transformative. And I don't think there's any lesser aspect to it from it being online, for sure. Just wanted to throw that out there. As someone personally who I did not have access to, even though I was in a fairly liberal town, due to my family, I did not have access to any kind of LGBT resources. I could not interact with those at all in personal. And so the online communities were really my saving grace personally.
I, again, keep finding myself the things to say. But I thank you, Alex, because that was in the back of my head too. I was also somebody who really needed those online communities when I was younger. But I wanted to note on the improving resources thing. A lot of the resource providers and organizations that do this stuff will say they want youth involvement, and they do want youth involvement. And when youth try to get involved, they discover structural barriers that make it hard. And it's not because anyone is like being evil and trying to shut anybody out, but they aren't being deliberately inclusive either. And I guess I want to say, if you are one of those young folks and you hit that resistance, you're not wrong, it's there. And so I think a lot of the time people are like, I'm not as welcome as they said I would be. This is strange. Did I do something wrong? And probably not. It's not usually you. And I would urge you to both lean on each other for some like reality checks and also some support, but also look for the adults and older adults that are like genuinely want you to be in places like that and ask for backup. I'm one of them. I will back you up. And there's a bunch of us. It's just that we don't like run everything. So a lot of the times we do want your voices in spaces. We want your power in spaces. But the people who run those spaces are busy and aren't necessarily particularly good at creating that. So I guess this is basically a don't give up and remember to lean on your resources.
Okay, and that's kind of, so we're just gonna kind of open it up really quick to anybody who would like to ask a question to one of our panelists up here. They're really cool people, so you should definitely ask them questions while they're here.
Very people.
So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, you can either put it in the chat or say it out loud, whatever you would like. If not, we have some backup questions we can ask them. So
We also have a wrap question that we can proceed with.
So I'll just give people a minute to type, but yeah. Okay, so if anybody has any questions on the long way, someone did say something. Okay, so are there things you can learn from earlier legislative battles is the one Evan wants to ask. And then there's another one after that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a great question because I just don't know where to begin. It's also a very complicated question. I will say this: I think whatever rights we can acquire and accrue, those rights can just as easily be taken away, right? So I think, to draw on a line from The Simpsons, right? The cost of freedom is eternal vigilance, right? We can't turn our backs just because we have legislative victories, right? We find new ways that our opponents are trying to take away rights, to challenge what we're doing, right? Think about the trajectory of marriage equality. Lawrence v. Texas goes to the Supreme Court, then all of a sudden you see states passing these marriage amendment laws, right? Restricting one man, one woman. You think about marriage equality, then you have issues about adoption. And now we have issues now focusing on our trans youth. And so again, they're always, these people, our opponents are always going to find new ways to sort of try to curtail our rights and freedom. And because we have these, we might have these victories. Again, it's incremental. It's a never-ending struggle. To paraphrase Coretta Scott King, we constantly have to keep fighting for to secure our rights, to secure the equality for all. I think that's the other thing, right? That these rights and victories that we sort of do get are not always are always connected to other groups, other people, other citizens. And so we have to also think more broadly about how I think how we can do more to be more intersectional in terms of the kind of political work that we're doing as well.
And I think one thing we can also learn from like our past is that keep fighting. Like eventually we're going to wear them down and we're going to win. Eventually people are going to be more progressive. Generations keep making this progress. You got to keep fighting. I don't know. That's kind of the way I take away from this. Like it might have taken me 2 years to finally get our city council to stop being so annoying. We'll go with that. And it ended, the first year we actually ended up, a lot of people weren't reelected because of their decision. And I think that's what you really have to think about, is that we need to keep fighting because progress will continue to be made as long as we keep fighting and keep working on it. Liliana also added another question. We have some more coming in. Liliana says, I absolutely agree with it about how important online communities are. That's how I came to terms with myself originally. And I know how vital they are when they are all you have. But I also saw so much hostility from random people on the internet. It made it difficult to cope. I think it depends somewhat on what kind of community it is, but it can be extremely difficult to make meaningful connections that way in my experience. And exposure to abuse is huge. So personally, I'm very interested in connections that are person to person and much safer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yes, online communities are so helpful and so important in this community as well. But I think it's also important to remember that those have their barriers as well. Like they're also imperfect, and also like the apps that we create those communities on, Instagram, Snapchat, all those also have algorithms and entire companies behind them with their own policies, with their own beliefs, with their own campaigns that they're supporting themselves, and their own lobbying that they're doing in legislations. So yeah, I think it's a very nuanced thing, and community is different for everyone. So kind of just like whatever floats your boat, I guess.
But yeah, I really get that person to person thing. I mean, like just scrolling through Facebook or Instagram, I'll see like 3 or 4 comments that are like, oh, this is just like super homophobic or transphobic. I'm not going to repeat a lot of them because they're really terrible. But yeah, I totally get that. And I think a lot of the person to person stuff is try to find local organizations like Out Maine or Quality Maine that kind of put those events out there. I know the Rainbow Ball is coming up at some point. There's a lot of events that are out there. I know there's some summer camps. There's lots of opportunity to get to person. You just kind of have to do some research. Quality Maine and Out Maine are really good places to start though. And I think those links are mostly in the chat. And then we have some more questions. Maggie asks, what advice would you give to young people trying to get involved in the fight against anti-queer, anti-trans legislation?
I think the number one thing I can say is try to let people know about it. The vast majority of people I talk to through my org are appalled when they hear about these anti-trans legislation and the anti-trans bills going on. They are not popular legislation. We have the data that shows that this anti-trans legislation is not popular, but it's going through and it's still being promoted because it's only being known by a very niche group. And so spreading the word and doing anything that you possibly can to get the word out about these bills and educate people about this crisis is a huge component of what you can do as a young person.
Is there anything anyone would like to add to that before we move on to the next one? Okay. Amanda wanted to add to kind of talk about the importance of writing as a form of resistance towards discriminative laws and interactions as a whole. They encourage the online community to be safe for everyone. The Youth Council of the League of Women Voters in Maine is looking for editorials from people who wish to write about important matters impacting them too. So she wants to kind of put that out there to anyone who would like to do that. But yeah, I think kind of writing is definitely a good thing to bring up because that's news. If people don't hear about things, they don't do things.
Oh, I also wanted to add, I forgot to include my message, but we're gonna plan to release newsletters, so that's also where the editorials are gonna go. So that would gladly be accepted.
But I also want to add to, I'm sorry, I may interrupt someone. No, I think it's not, writing is really important, it's wonderful, but so is art, so is, music, so are, I mean, so is design. There's so many different ways in which I think creativity can be a really powerful tool of politics and resistance. And so I think there's lots of opportunities. We have, lots of ways now that people can create websites and create different kinds of forums, that can foster perhaps some of the kinds of communities that so that people in the chat are sort of feeling that might be lacking. Again, sort of finding things that pursue your interests, that work with your strengths, can be very powerful political tools as well.
Okay, and we're kind of getting towards the end of our time. Oh,
sorry, that was me. If you can just repeat the
yes.
I didn't catch that.
So Amanda and some other interns are doing a newsletter for the League of Women Voters that includes, Amanda, if you want to do it talk about this really fast, you totally can. You might be.
Right now, oh yeah, I'm just on like the infrastructure team, and we're mostly working like social media outreach and also with the newsletter we plan to send. I think it's bi-weekly we have set right now, but in this we also want to have editorials from people who want to send editorials to us about issues concerning them. Then gladly, I think we set up an email for the youth council. I'll double check, but we plan to, and we gladly will accept editorials and release them in the newspaper that we release.
And it looks like Allison is probably typing it right into the chat as we speak. And then I think where we're kind of getting towards the end of our time here, I'm going to kind of give up our wrap-up question here. And that is, how do we build a community that cares for, centers, welcomes, and protects our trans and queer comrades?
Very broad question, but I guess maybe highlight things that we all feel are kind of the most important or most overlooked in building communities that center our and protect our trans and queer comrades.
I'll lead with one that I think also feels the spirit of the chat, right? The recognition of the diversity of experiences, right? I think it's not, we often want to look for people that we find solidarity with. But at the same time, I think one of the challenges with politics, and we get into political issues, is the fact that we sometimes collapse important categories that often leave out certain groups of people in a lot of important ways. And so I think, it is about living and embracing intersectionality when we are talking about building and fostering community, right? Not necessarily centering our own voices, but recognizing that centering our own voices means putting our voices alongside of many other voices that, again, helps think about the strength and breadth of our communities.
Just something quick to add on to that about the intersectionality. I think that is so important to think about how much space you're taking up, even in the communities that we are building or the resources that we are amplifying or starting. Like, if you are a cis person in these spaces, think about how much space you're taking up. If you are a white person in these spaces, think about how much space you're taking up. If you are wealthy and so many other things. So just like the intersection really piece of that really hit home for me, because I think sometimes the people who are most victimized by these legislations are the people who are also doing the hard work to fight them and also being ignored. It's really unfortunate. But yeah, just think about how much space you're taking up. Be mindful of that.
I think a really big part of that is kind of be aware of your privilege. Like, I'm a white person. I know that I'm not being affected by these bills as much as other people are. And I know that I need to kind of give space to other people who kind of know more about these issues than I do, like all that good stuff. Alex, is there anything you want to say on this?
I guess it's pretty much, this question is pretty much what we've been speaking to the whole time. I guess I'll just agree with what Michaela and Theo have already said. But I'll also just say that we really need to consciously prioritize the most vulnerable among us in order to affect actual change.
Does anybody in the group want to add anything? I think Elizabeth and I and our mentors and our panelists have put in a lot, but also if you're a guest and you want to speak, please feel free. And if not, we can move towards kind of reflections if we like. It's wonder, but thank you for this session. Thanks so much for coming. And yeah, if there's nothing to, if people don't have anything to add. All right, yeah, I think no one's gonna add anything. So, what question should we do to close out? Alice, do you want to give us something fun like you usually do? Like a question to pick?
I can come in. I have a tradition of ending some of our meeting spaces with a this or that kind of question. And I think I will end tonight's with one that we debated quite thoroughly at our last meeting of like, if you had to choose one breakfast food to kind of end yours like eternity and your weekend with, would you be a kind of waffles and a sweet breakfast food person, or would you be a savory burrito breakfast food person? And feel free to like throw it in the chat or just come off mute. I will let you all know right now, I am a sweet breakfast food person. I will always choose waffles over burritos.
Also, the guidelines, the rules no longer apply. All bets are off. You can get a little bit more aggressive now.
I'm gonna say again, breakfast burritos are superior in every single aspect, I believe, in the breakfast food criteria. And I won't debate anyone on this. I'm very passionate about this. And I was very passionate last time, and I will continue.
I'm with you, Amanda. I'm also a very savory burrito person. I think they're the best.
I hate to disagree, but I really love waffles. But it's like, and Maggie's with me. Yeah, waffles, you guys, way better.
I always ruin this because I want a savory waffle. Cornmeal, jalapenos, maybe some fried chicken on top. That's breakfast / lunch or dinner.
That is one way to go. Just combine them.
Yeah, I know it kind of breaks the question. If you make me pick though, savory.
Liliana, I also threw that in last time. Are crepes a sweet burrito? I mean, I know you can make crepey crepes, but are they a sweet burrito? And we had some opinions about that too.
So Susanna wants to add that she feels like she's missing something because she's never had a burrito, but you can't find much wrong with waffles. So, I mean, yeah. Very good point.
You should have a burrito.
Since she's on team savory waffles too, I guess we need to get brunch.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, savory waffles. There we go. Yeah, I didn't notice that.
Curveball.
Okay, so that's kind of wrapping us up for the evening. Thank you so much for joining us. A big round of applause for Theo and Alex. They are super amazing to talk to. Super appreciate you guys for being here and giving us your time. I appreciate you guys for just kind of showing up to discuss with us. That was awesome. I love that you guys are here. Michaela, anything you want to say before we kind of end this up?
Not really. I'm guessing I'll be following up with some communication with a lot of people in this room after, so not really.
Okay, and then I believe that we have a document with all the resources we were talking about tonight. If yes, okay, I'm seeing nods, so we're gonna go with that. So but yeah, thank you guys for coming. I think that's about it. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
There is a reasonable chance Holly has stepped away from their computer.
Well done.
Turn.
You both. Very, very well done. That was a really lovely conversation that you should feel very proud of yourselves. I feel very proud, and I really loved listening in on that space you both created this evening. So like, so many well dones.
I kind of feel bad. Nobody was really discussing, so I'm like, you know what? Michaela and I, we're gonna do this discussion. We are the ones who are discussing now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone in the audience that I know DM'd me to talk about how ridiculously good at things you both are, just so you know.
We're just the best, obviously.
We got feedback mid-event that was just like, what the, they're in high school?
Okay, that's so sweet.
I'm glad Liliana and Alex were getting in like a fight in the chat. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I got a little worried about that for a second. I was like,
we're just not gonna talk about that.
I'm hearing a lot of unmet need from Liliana. Does anyone actually know them? No? Okay.
But we should have their email. So
just follow up and be like, are you okay?
yeah.
If you need like extra support, we're here. We will be your new parents.
You can join this community. We're kind of an online community because we have to be, but we're also friendly and protected a little bit from the crazies of the crazy online community.
Yeah.
We're not, I mean, we're a little crazy. We're not too bad.
We're crazy. We don't hurt people. We just
Other than Jocelyn negging me. That's like the worst we get. And obviously that's just a running bit.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
Because I'm great and she knows it.
Yeah.
That was.
You should know it too.
Yes, I agree.
I'm not big on false modesty. And I tell my kids that too. I'm like, no child of mine needs to pretend that you're less than you are. Get out there and strut.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
One of them is good at that and the other one is a bit shy. So.
They'll get there.
I'm so happy. Our timing was like perfect. Like it was awesome. Like we're actually getting done like sort of close to when we said we would. I thought we were gonna be done super early. And I think Holly just finally realized that we were just talking and they did not be there.
That was me. I realized I could put them in the way.
Oh, you kicked them. I forgot that we could do that.
Oh, it doesn't
I was gonna say like, oh, how long has they been listening? That was a little bit weird.
Oh no, they're human beings after the no, you're fine.
Yeah.
That was I was so, because I didn't do really any of the support for planning this, it's why I had so much to say, because it's not like I was working on it or whatever. I was just here as a person who wanted to, who cares, but yeah, I came in very cold, and so I was just I was very impressed. And
I know you were like, oh, I'm not gonna say anything. I'm just gonna sit back and relax. I'm super tired.
I couldn't help it because there were things.
No, that's great. We loved when you were talking. It was good.
Evan talking.
If there had been a lot more chatter from other folks, then I probably wouldn't have, because other people would have been saying the same things. But
yeah,
and my voice doesn't always have to be front. But yeah. I need to be Theo's friend.
That's what I'm saying.
I thought this too. Yes.
He lives in my city, and I think the only reason we don't already know each other is a pandemic. Otherwise, I'm fairly sure we would.
Yeah. Think about me. What if I end up in his class and embarrass myself with like
You
my
can be
friends.
friends with your professors.
I had a professor I got quite close to in undergrad. And it was really kind of fun because when I graduated, she ran over and gave me a hug and said, "We can be friends now."
That's so cute.
That's like my mom's done with like half her professors because she's a music teacher. So like you keep performing with your directors because it's a very involved thing and it just keeps going. So yeah, like she's in like a band with like half her professors. And like, that's weird.
It just keeps growing.
Mhm.
I got some students that keep in touch with me too from back when I was teaching college. So
You were a teacher? I
You
didn't
taught
know that.
college?
I was a grad student and I taught. Theoretically I assisted, but actually I just taught.
You mean you're
Because-
exploited?
Honestly, not really. I did okay. I mean, the university was exploiting me. My teacher that I worked for had cancer, so I taught his classes. So for a bit there. But
Sorry.
I was reasonably good at it. So they kept sticking me in front of students instead of like, here, grade papers. It was like, oh, you can give the lecture. So I taught for a couple of years.
I feel like both of you are beautiful lecture givers too. I think you just proved your orating skills in a million ways. I think that it was very, very beautifully done. And we'll take tomorrow kind of as just like a radio silence, absorb your day, take your rest time. And then on Friday, we'll get together with some like to-dos. So like take tomorrow, absorb the glory of this beautiful success and to give yourselves lots of pats on the back and whatever you do to celebrate because you deserve it.